Welcome, everyone. I'm Glen Howard, president of the Jamestown Foundation. We're happy that you're joining us for another episode of Eastern Approaches. This interview series is named after the famous book of the same name by former British diplomat, spy, and adventurer Sir Fitzroy Maclean. Each episode of Jamestown's Eastern Approaches features conversations with renowned experts on the most important geostrategic issues facing the United States and Eurasia, particularly those areas of Eurasia often missing in today's headlines. Today, we're taking you to the Caucasus and the mountainous region of Nagorno Karabakh. I want to interview one of the world's foremost experts on this region, someone who's traveled to this region, knows it quite well, and spent a big part of his career and life writing about this. The author with us today is Thomas Goltz, the author of Azerbaijan Diary. We're happy to have Thomas Goltz with us for this episode and delighted that he's joining us today from his ranch / oil villa in Montana, also known as the Compound. So, Thomas, we're very happy that you're here with us today. We wanted to introduce the fans of Jamestown to someone that's traveled to this region, been there quite extensively, and has written a monumental work, if not several works, on the region, and to educate a new generation of people that are interested in the Caucasus and who may someday want to read your book. So I'm very delighted that you're here with us today. Very much would like to point out to our readers, your book is called Azerbaijan Diary. For those, you can pick it up on Amazon. It's an extraordinary work. Thomas, thank you for being with us today.
Pleasure to be here.
Well, I wanted to ask you that obviously Azerbaijan is in the headlines again today with the fighting in Karabakh, and you spent a great deal of your time reporting there, and you obviously wrote a book about Azerbaijan. Can you explain to some of the people watching what is it about Karabakh that is so important to Azerbaijan? And can you describe, the beauty, the physical beauty of Karabakh, the importance of a place like Shusha that was the ancient mosque that was built there, what it means to Azerbaijani culture, and then kind of segue into what happened in Khojaly. You made reference to it a couple times. I don't think many Westerners are familiar with the massacre that occurred there. And what is your kind of, what did you see and just describe that? So all in 10 minutes or less. No, I'm just kidding. So, but please just kind of walk us through that kind of this narrative about Karabakh.
Karabakh once was an independent khanate under a Khan, or Muslim Azerbaijani leader. Slowly but surely, when the Russians pushed down into the South Caucasus via the North Caucasus, taking Georgia, and then what we should properly call northeast, or rather northwest Iran, populated at that time by a mixture of Azerbaijanis, various other Muslim ethnic groups, and some Armenians as well. But in order to de-Azerbaijanify and de-Muslimize its recently acquired lands in the early 19th century, the Russian czars initiated a program of transporting Armenians from Iran, Safavid Iran or Qajar Iran, into these borderland areas, including the erstwhile Khanate of Karabakh, thus starting to mess with the demographics of the area. Slowly but surely, parts of Karabakh became predominantly Armenian, and other parts of Karabakh became less and less Azerbaijani or less and less Muslim. Fast forward until the creation of the Soviet Union and the creation of Soviet Azerbaijan, Soviet Armenia, Soviet Georgia. At that time, Yerevan, the capital of today's Armenia, was actually predominantly Azerbaijani or Muslim city. But there were other areas that were predominantly Armenian in the Karabakh region. One of those took on the name of Upper or Mountainous Karabakh, which in Russian, of course, is Nagorno Karabakh. But it was an issue of what do we call it in English? The gerrymandering of the population, because while the upper parts of Karabakh may have had a Armenian majority, the lower parts of Karabakh, the Valley Karabakh, had the Azerbaijani majority. In any case, smack dab in the middle of all this is a city, old city. I'm not sure how, if we want to call it ancient or not, but certainly it is several centuries old or older, called Shusha, which the Azerbaijanis have declared, rightly so, of being the font of their national culture, font of their national music called mugham, font of poetry, etc. And so that it is a very dear place for all Azerbaijanis. Down mountain from Shusha is a place called Khankenti, which was the traditional capital, which is called in Armenian and in Russian Stepanakert, which is kind of an insult to the Azerbaijanis, not only of changing the name of a city, but also because it's named after one of the Bolshevik leaders of the massacres in Baku of 1917, when the Armenians and Bolsheviks took over Baku and basically ethnically cleansed it of all Azerbaijanis. In any case, as the conflict in and around Karabakh was starting to spin out of control, I made several journeys to Shusha and also to a little town called Khojaly, which was the only fixed-wing airport inside of larger Karabakh, and obviously has some strategic importance. I noted this, and the commander of the airport, a gentleman by the name of Colonel Alif Khadjev, he noted this as well. But the conflict had still not really spun out of control. The Armenians were taking over village after village after village. My last trip by a helicopter to Khojaly, because it was surrounded, was with Colonel Khadjev on a dare. This was in late January 1992. And it was just so clear that the place was doomed. It was also clear that Baku, still under the leadership of the last communist first party secretary of the Communist Party of Azerbaijan, now nominally the president of the Republic of Azerbaijan, namely Ayaz Mutalibov, he could have opened up lines of communication to Khojaly, created a corridor to at least evacuate the place, but he did not. As a result, the Armenians crept closer and closer, and then on the evening of February 26, 1992, they had completely surrounded the town. They then declared that they were opening up a humanitarian corridor for self-ethnic cleansing of the local population. But something went awry, or maybe it was part of their plan. This is disputed back and forth, but what is not disputed was that things got very, very ugly, and the Armenians closed in and killed, either in Khojaly, on the streets of Khojaly, or in this so-called humanitarian corridor, which is really a corridor of death, some 633 Azerbaijanis, making it the worst massacre of the Karabakh conflict to date. It's something that I was reporting on from Agdam. I had to fight to get reports into the Washington Post and elsewhere because people just could not believe that the Armenians were slaughtering Azerbaijanis, quote unquote, Turks, and not the other way around. I finally got a lot of this reporting into the Washington Post, the Sunday Times of London, and elsewhere, and was execrated for this by the Armenian lobby in the United States and elsewhere, called a liar, a fabricator, a pawn of big oil, a convert to Islam, all manner of nasty stuff. But it was true. And finally, Armenians have even come around to admitting that it was true, that there was this awful massacre in Khojaly that particular evening. That has created a permanent scar inside the Azerbaijani consciousness, I would say. There are statues to Khojaly in Baku and elsewhere. And the essential, and there are conferences every year, some of which I speak at, to be called a liar, a fabricator, and stooge of the Azerbaijanis by the Armenians who tend to show up at these conferences at the back of the room. The main thing is that although some Armenians have finally admitted that there was a massacre at Khojaly, conducted by mainly diaspora Armenians, apparently from Egypt, Lebanon, elsewhere, there has been no official recognition of Khojaly. The Armenians turn this around and they say, what about Sumgayit? What about Sumgayit, which was the city north of Baku in Azerbaijan, where in late February 1989, there were the so-called Sumgayit pogroms. 32 people died. It's another story entirely. But the main point is that there was a trial of the perpetrators at Sumgayit. There was some sort of justice. There was an investigation that was Soviet style, legal, but it happened. That has never happened for Khojaly.
So, in light of what you see now occurring in Karabakh with this fighting, what's the difference now between Azerbaijan in the year 2020 and say the Azerbaijan of 1992? I mean, you spent a lot of time in this region. What is the difference in terms of nationalism, mindset? Has Azerbaijan finally found its sense of national identity?
The comparison between Azerbaijan of 1991, when I first arrived, and certainly 1992, when it was really looking like a failed state. 4 presidents or acting presidents, the collapse of the Karabakh front, collapse of the economy, and the Azerbaijan of today, 2020, is almost night and day on every level. Certainly materially, the two cannot be compared. Oil and gas have made an enormous difference in terms of infrastructure construction, not only in Baku, in the so-called rayons, in the provinces as well. I was on a book tour of the Azerbaijani version of my book on Azerbaijan about 2 or 3 years ago. And I went to Sheki, and we went to Ganje, and we went to Taoz as well. All places that I had been to before, but maybe not for a couple of years. It was astounding. The roads, the buildings, the this, that, and the other thing, the looks on people's faces, So materially, it was a huge difference between 91, 92, and 2020. I would like to believe that there is also a huge difference in terms of mindset about who the Azerbaijanis are, who they were then and who they are today. In 91, 92, regionalism was dominant, to the point where I remember speaking with individuals in Baku who said that they would gladly go fight the Armenians once the Armenians came to Baku, but they had no intention of going off and fighting anywhere near Karabakh or in Genge or in Sabirabad or elsewhere. So today, that I think one of the things we're seeing on the battlefield as well is an Azerbaijani identity that has been honed over the last 20 years or so. That has to do with education. That has to do with wealth. That has to do with so many different factors. Some of the glue that is there, it's very, very soft political stuff. It's the national music, Mugham, which the First Lady of Azerbaijan has made a very specific case of promoting. So it's lovely music that I recommended to you to listen to as well. Sports, there are sports centers in all of the provinces, very, very well equipped. The Azerbaijanis are devoted to the idea of sport, not only Olympic stuff, but football, wrestling, and have been taking down prizes at various international fora. This also goes into the being part of the glue of the new Azerbaijani. Let's see what will, and if the Azerbaijani army is successful in retaking more of Karabakh, occupied Karabakh, or even all of Karabakh, obviously that's going to be a huge jolt for the national psyche as well, because Karabakh remains a scar, and a scar of dishonor for most Azerbaijanis today.
And do you think that the future is, do you think the war will keep going on until they reach a negotiated stage, or do you see, it's an entirely different topic to discuss kind of Armenian nationalism, but it certainly seems that Armenian nationalism too is plays a very important role here in how they view Karabakh, but Azerbaijan equally has its own, as you say, determination to regain Karabakh. But is there finally a state that exists that's been built by the Aliyevs, starting with Haidar Aliyev, now down to Ilham, that they built, that is going to kind of I don't know if it'll outlast this conflict, but I mean, it seems like the war has been its kind of core identity, is trying, and many Azerbaijanis have lost sense of kind of understanding Karabakh. It was more something for the older generation, but you see now on the streets of Baku, a new younger generation that truly identifies with Karabakh. And so that it doesn't seem to have been lost. That's what I'm trying to say. But where do you see this kind of the direction going for Azerbaijan now?
Oh, I wish I knew. I wish I had the proverbial crystal ball. I don't see how this ends nicely, because the passions on both sides, the Azerbaijani side, particularly the youth, as well as the Armenian side, are in full passionate glow. When asked what my solution to the Karabakh conflict is. I used to come up with this ending thing of saying that Azerbaijan has to create a forward-looking, truly democratic, healthy, wealthy society, multicultural, multi-religious society, until the Armenians of Karabakh start to beg to be part of the Azerbaijani experiment. A couple of years ago, that sounded kind of good, if unrealistic. But given the current amount of tension and fighting and bitterness of this most recent round of the Karabakh conflict, I don't know how anybody's going to get to that point. I don't see how Ilham Aliyev can actually fulfill his promise to the Azerbaijani Armenians of Karabakh, that they too are equal citizens of Azerbaijan, they will be looked after, etc. Will they be ethnically cleansed? Will they ethnically cleanse themselves? I don't know. I've heard reports, read reports that some half of the population of mountainous Karabakh, of occupied Karabakh, has already fled to Armenia. I cannot verify that, but this is what is going around. And then there are other disturbing aspects of this most recent round of fighting in the Karabakh conflict zone. And by that I mean, of course,
how closely, when you were covering the war, were Russian soldiers working with Armenians? I mean, I've heard reports that many of the units were led by Russians, that they weren't just fighting it wasn't Azeris fighting Armenians, but there were Russians leading and directing the war inside Karabakh.
The question of Russian involvement back in the first Karabakh War, call it 92 to 94, is obscure, but it's provable. Russia was sending in fighters and pilots to both sides. I had the occasion of running into 4 Russian mercenaries who had been picked up in the summer of 92 and were to stand trial, and mortal trial, until finally, under the Elchibey government, until finally Elchibey was overthrown. And one of the things that Heydar Aliyev did to placate the Russians up in Moscow was to amnesty these 4 clowns and send them back to Russia. On the Armenian side, and clearly these were Russians fighting for the Armenians as mercenaries. The question about who was commanding the Armenian troops inside of Karabakh between 92 and 94 is a very, very good question. My understanding is that many, if not most, were not Russians, but were actually Russified Armenians living in Russia, who had been serving in the Red Army and then the Russian army, who then came down to serve their second homeland. Does that count as being mercenaries? I don't know. I suspect so. If you're a Russian citizen and you have not yet thrown away your Russian passport and acquired an Armenian passport, I guess that would suggest that you're fighting for a foreign flag. How decisive these individuals were, once again, certainly 92 to 94, they were decisive. They reconquered Karabakh and adjacent territories, and then have remained in occupation ever since. Interesting question right now that is coming up and is getting quite a bit of play in the Western media is the idea of Syrian mercenaries working for Azerbaijan. I find this dubious, But at the same time, I've been reading reports that suggest very, very strongly that some of these individuals may be in Azerbaijan. Now, the question is, are they Arabs? Are they Turkmen? And if Turkmen, is there any difference for a Turkmen to feel the call of the diaspora and go and fight along with the Azerbaijanis? Now, that all said, I think it's really stupid of Azerbaijan to let these people in, even if just as cannon fodder, because it is immediate negative press. And it has an echo back to the bad old days of 1992, 93, 94, when there were mercenaries from Afghanistan fighting with Azerbaijan.
I mean, and Azerbaijan was a different place then. I mean, there were people, they were willing to accept a lot of fighters to come in to try to help them. But, you know, in the past 20 years, Azerbaijan has built the national army. And there's over 10 million Azerbaijanis now. So one could ask, what is the military benefit of bringing in Syrians or Syrian Turkmen and taking orders in Azerbaijani to go and be cannon fodder for the to fight the Armenians? I mean, I guess, I mean, you're very kind of skeptical about that. I mean, it's especially for a country like Azerbaijan that's been very averse to jihadism and radical Islam. You know, there's this danger that it could import this by allowing in these fighters, and you seem to be quite skeptical about that.
Yeah, show me. That's what I got to say. Show me. But logically, it doesn't make any sense, because most of these Syrian fighters, so-called, being backed by Turkey, are by definition going to be Sunni Muslims. And so that you're injecting, and also have a little bit of jihadi flavor about them, as most of these Syrian groups backed by Turkey in Syria do have, and you're injecting them into a largely secular Shia society. It boggles the mind.
And also one is highly secular.
We'll see.
And so I mean, I've been witnessed in Baku of sometimes walking back from restaurants, you see people doing namaz and praying. And one Azerbaijani friend said that's forbidden. You know, they don't allow people on the side streets to go out and worship and pray. It is a very still kind of tightly regulated society in Azerbaijan. For anyone like yourself or I, you know, have been there, know that it's a highly secular culture, and that there's a danger to this. And I just can't imagine Erdogan getting on the phone with Aliyev saying, "Hey, I want to bring 1,000 Syrian fighters in to fight in Karabakh." I mean, it just doesn't. When you have a vast population, 10 million, it just doesn't really make sense at all. No. But Tom, can you describe, or Thomas, describe the weather, the mountainous, what are the difficulties of fighting in Karabakh? I mean, you have these. You've talked about Moravdog. You know, you've indicated that the things like the weather, the climate, there's a lot of conditions that affect fighting in Karabakh, and then also the terrain of Karabakh differs from the areas, say, in the northwestern part down to the low-lying areas of Karabakh near Iran. What can you just walk us through that?
The geography of Karabakh is fairly simple. It has a valley, and there is the Karabakh Massif, or the mountain, much of which is inside of Armenia. I remember speaking with a visiting American colonel coming down from Moscow, I believe, in the early days of the conflict. And I had a big map on the wall, a relief map of Azerbaijan, as well as certainly of Karabakh. And the good colonel took one look and he said, and he kind of drew his finger all around the Karabakh Massif. He said, that is what they're going to have difficulty securing, meaning the Azerbaijanis. The lowland stuff, Valley Karabakh, is basically, call it tank country. And the Azerbaijani military has made significant progress in taking back those areas of occupied Karabakh down by the Iranian frontier and the Oxus River and other areas in the east. They are going to be facing, the Azerbaijani forces are going to be facing a much tougher sludge when they start working their way uphill. And the president of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, has already admitted as much, saying, this is what we've taken. Now the hard part begins because we're going from down up. And anybody who's been in a conflict situation understands very, very well that the terrain, you want to dominate the terrain, meaning high points, etc. And that is what the Azerbaijanis will be going up against, entrenched positions, Armenian positions in Karabakh, going stage by stage back into mountainous Karabakh, where it's going to be hellishly difficult to make real progress there. And I only hope that that the Azerbaijani initiative over the last couple of weeks will result in serious ceasefire discussions, followed by the withdrawal of Armenian forces from Karabakh and the restitution of some sort of peace and reconciliation within Karabakh itself before more life is lost. Am I optimistic about that result? Quite frankly, Glenn, I have to say I am not. I think that this is going to be slogging on over the fall and maybe into the winter.
That's what many people do expect. I share your kind of outlook. Doesn't look good. I would like to ask you, and it's one of the dying questions I've had since I wanted to set up this interview, was how in the world did you end up as a war journalist / reporter covering the war in Karabakh? Can you just kind of take us from your origins of having been born in Japan and then moving to, I believe it was North Dakota or South Dakota, and then kind of how did you end up in this business? Let's hear the Thomas Goltz story.
Well, if I have any system of belief, it would be fate, Sluchaynost, Schicksal, Kismet, allowing things to happen, preparing myself for whatever happens next. Briefly, I was born in Japan, raised in Fargo, North Dakota. I had no interest in international affairs whatsoever. I graduated from my high school in 1972. I was unaware that there had even been an Israeli-Arab war in 1967. Then I started to travel. I did not immediately go to the university. And if I had one interest, it was theater, of all things. So I traveled around the United States, and then I ended up in Chicago at the Goodman School of Drama, only for 1 year, joined a troupe of players in Chicago that brought me to New York, at which point I tried to pursue a career as an actor, not particularly successful, but also of writing plays, and I was more successful there. I had 2 works produced off Broadway. And so that I mention this because I was always engaged in writing from a very, very young age. Then I decided it was time to learn a foreign language, and I started with Hebrew and then dropped that and went to German, which seemed to be a lot more useful in the world than Hebrew. unless you're an Israeli. So as a result of that, I moved to Berlin, where I was an Anstreicher und Landstreicher, which means a painter and a highwayman. And then I got kicked out of my apartment, a commune outside of Kreuzberg, which was the Turkish section of town. And it being midwinter, rather than looking for another dwelling in Berlin, West Berlin, I decided it was high time to hitchhike to Africa, of all things. I had a brother there who was playing music in Nairobi, Kenya, and so I began my my international adventures at that point. I got to Nairobi via war-torn Ethiopia. First time I ever really got shot at. After having spent about 2 weeks in Yemen, North Yemen at the time, waiting for a dhow to take me across the Red Sea, which is where I started to teach myself Arabic, having nothing else to do. So I got to Nairobi and discovered my brother was already gone, and then considered what I should do with the rest of my life. And I realized that I liked travel, that I was good with languages, good with memorizing things. And so I got back to New York to attend New York University on a full scholarship with a focus on German literature and the Middle East, because I was working on Arabic. And I succeeded at both of these things, and then ended up having the opportunity to go to northern Syria to a archaeological site just outside the town of Raqqa, which of course was to become the capital, short-lived capital of the Islamic State. So I was on this archaeological dig, a pleasure house from the period of Harun al-Rashid, and the individual running the archaeological site was the #2 in the National Museum with connections with the American Embassy. And he said, there's a new program of studying Arabic in Damascus, and one of the individuals has dropped out. Would you like to take that place? And I said, absolutely. So I moved to Damascus, studied Arabic for a year, was then thrown in jail on suspicion of being a spy. That was not pleasant. And then, in effect, evicted from the country. So I went to Egypt, to Alexandria, to cool heel and continue studying my Arabic and to teach, at which point NYU then offered me another full scholarship, but on the condition that I study Turkish, because there was only one other registered student in this new pilot class in Turkish, and they had to have 2 registered students in order to keep it open. So that is how I began my transition away from the Arab world and into the Turkic world. I did well. There was another Turkish class in Istanbul in the summer of 1982 that my university, NYU, came up with the money for me to study in. And the rest, as they say, is history. I ran into a woman in Turkey. Eventually, she became my wife. Combining travel with writing, I decided it was time to declare myself to be a journalist. And I began writing first for the UPI, then for the Associated Press, and then as a freelancer for a variety of other outlets in the English-speaking world, and elsewhere too, in the German-speaking world. That lasted about 10 years. So I was Turkey-based. Then I heard about this outfit called the Institute of Current World Affairs that was connected to the erstwhile King Crane Foundation, which was in turn connected through Mr. Crane to the study done post-World War I by Woodrow Wilson, called the King Crane Commission Report, which was a study about what the United States should be doing in former Ottoman lands in the Middle East. In other words, what sort of policy should we have as Americans there? In any case, that was sort of the my intellectual heritage to the Middle East. I'd heard about this Institute of Current World Affairs. I applied, and lo and behold, I received a 2-year fellowship to go and study the Turkic-speaking republics of then Soviet Central Asia. So I moved all my stuff to Tashkent. I thought I was going to be living in Uzbekistan, and basically there was no connection to the Caucasus yet. But when I tried to leave Turkey, I went to the Aeroflot office and to buy a ticket from Istanbul via Moscow to Tashkent. And the authorities said, no, Moscow is not on your visa. You've got to go back to the United States and get a new one. This was way too much. But there was a guy, the chief reporter for the news agency TASS. He probably always thought that I was a spy. I certainly always thought that he was a spy, but he was from this place called Soviet Azerbaijan. And he was always extolling the fraternal connections between Azerbaijan and the Republic of Turkey. So now it was time to lean on him. We were friendly enough. I called him up and I said, Yelchin, what do I do? I've got to get to Tashkent. He said, well, there is a new flight to the capital of my Soviet Republic, namely Azerbaijan, from Istanbul once a week. It costs a lot of money, but if you can get yourself on that flight, my family will be waiting for you at customs in Baku, Azerbaijan, Soviet Azerbaijan. And then if you can talk your way through customs, my family will be waiting for you. Well, so it came to pass. We bought the tickets. It was just a chaotic flight. You know, there were people with chickens on board and this, that, and the other thing. And there was no seating arrangement. An old, beg your pardon, Tupolev. We got there, and evoking a little bit of pan-Turkic enthusiasm, we talked, my Turkish wife and myself, without visas to Soviet Azerbaijan. We talked our way through customs. And lo and behold, on the far side of the barrier was this group of 5 individuals, Yelchin's family, waiting for us with a sign saying, welcome, Thomas and Hijran. By bizarre coincidence, one of those individuals was a 20-year-old young man from Azerbaijan, student of history at Baku State University by the name of Farid Shafayev. We have known each other literally from the moment that I and my wife entered Azerbaijan. Anyway, once again, having no visas, we could not check into a hotel. So they took us to a place known as the Center of Islamic Fundamentalism and the cut flower mafia outside of Baku called Mashtaga, where the driver of Farid Shafayev's mother, who ran a oil bath sanatorium, had his house. And so our first look at Azerbaijan was through this lens of Mashtaga, and exactly at the time of the Shiite Ashura ceremonies. And so people were going around whipping themselves with chains, etc. So our first impressions of Azerbaijan were thus that this place was about to turn into some sort of radical Iran-style Shia republic.
And for those who are watching the show who don't know much about Azerbaijan, please explain that Azerbaijanis are Turkic, but their religion is Shia. Would you like to just explain?
Turks are primarily Sunni Muslims. And Azerbaijani Turks, if you will, are primarily Shia Muslims. Although there is some crossover, there are Shia in Turkey and there are Sunni in Azerbaijan. In any case, back to Mashtaga, the Shiite Ashura, people are going around whipping each other, moaning and groaning about the fate of the Prophet's grandson Hussein. And then one fine day, our host said, it's time to take a road trip. And so we all piled into a Volvo And we went to the second city in Azerbaijan called Ganje. This was not part of our program. And it being Azerbaijan, everybody decided it was time to have a barbecue up mountain. So we started climbing the Morov Mountains, which are now obviously a place of interest because of the renewed war with Armenia. Got about halfway up there and discovered ourselves to be in a place called Chaykent. It had been cleared of Armenian, called them rebels, just days before, and was still on fire. We drove through there. We kept on going up higher and higher. On the
And what
road.
year was this? What year was this?
This is summer of 91, June or July of 91. There still is a Soviet Union. So we got up there, and it was so clear that this thing called Karabakh was starting to spin out of control. We returned to Baku, and then we decided to go find the only Azerbaijani that we'd ever heard about before, the so-called first Turk in the Politburo. There's a picture of him behind me. I don't see if you can see that. Can you make out Brezhnev?
No, I can't, but I think I know who it is.
We got to this, we decided to take the train to this place called Nakhchivan to discover this individual, this first Turk in the Politburo. And our hosts were sure that we were going to die. They tried to prevent us from going, but we were insistent. So we got on this awful train and trundled south until we got to the border with Armenia. We kept on going there, but there were Soviet/Russian border guards with guns on the trains just to make sure that we could get through. And then we got to this place called Nakhchivan. And lo and behold, that is where I first met Haydar Aliyev. So that was a relationship that began in the summer of 91 when there still was a Soviet Union and lasted until his death in December of 2003.
Was he a member of the Politburo at that time?
No, he'd been kicked out by Gorbachev, and he had quit the Communist Party and had started this independence movement in Nakhchivan, which was then to spill over to Azerbaijan, but was instrumental in tearing down the border fences with Iran, so that the Nakhchivani Azerbaijanis could go and meet their kith and kin in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Extraordinary. Anyway, that's where I met this extraordinary individual, and it became so clear to me that he was not going to content himself with being the boss of miniature Nakhchivan, but had bigger things in store. So we returned to Baku, and then it was finally time to move on to Tashkent. Took a plane there. Internal flights were easy and super cheap. Got to Tashkent and had been there for about a week when suddenly the news was there's a conservative putsch against Gorbachev, August 19th, 1991. And once again, it was clear that the Soviet Union was on its way out. Even though Gorbachev was coming back, etc., it was such a chaotic time. You could go anywhere. You could go anywhere. And so we went up from Tashkent to Moscow, and then started hearing about this super conservative post-Soviet republic that had backed the putsch against Gorbachev, called Soviet Socialist Republic of Azerbaijan. And by this time we knew, through our adventures in Ganje, our adventures in Nakhchivan, our adventures in and around Baku, that while the government of late Soviet Azerbaijan may have been anti-Gorbachev and conservative, namely that of Ayaz Mutalibov, the population was not. We'd gone to school in Azerbaijan, as it were. We'd learned about this thing called the Popular Front. We'd learned about the events of Black January 1990, when Gorbachev sent in the tanks and the Red Army to put down the independence movement that was growing in Azerbaijan, sort of aping what was happening in the Baltic states. So we decided to take advantage of the chaos of travel in the late Soviet Union and travel back to Soviet Socialist Azerbaijan to take a look of what was really happening on the ground, because I was tired of these Moscow-based reports on the BBC, on the radios, Free Europe and Liberty, of reporting in the New York Times and elsewhere about this conservative place called Azerbaijan. So we went down and I planned on spending about a week reporting. And as a fellow of the Institute of Current World Affairs, they did not smile on my reporting. I was supposed to be there doing deep research on Soviet Central Asia. Azerbaijan was not even part of the package, the 2-year fellowship that I had acquired. So what are you doing there? But I started taking notes about events in Azerbaijan and using them as my monthly and sometimes weekly correspondence with the Institute of Current World Affairs, managing to get them back to the headquarters, then in Hanover, New Hampshire, now in DC, and started to go with the flow. Part of that flow was as this thing called the Karabakh conflict was starting to spin out of control, I ineluctably was drawn closer and closer to it, because I was the first registered journalist, foreign journalist in Azerbaijan, with press card number 00001. I could hardly say no when the new foreign ministry organized a helicopter trip to a place called Shusha, which was kind of under siege by the Armenians. And so I went to Shusha, and then I linked up there with some security guys, Oman men, Oman being the gendarme of the former Soviet Union, sort of military police or militarized police with APCs, etc. And then they decided that they did not decide. Then came news that there had been an attack on a small town or village in northern Karabakh called Imret Karvant, near the Sarasank Reservoir. And so a fact-finding mission was organized, and I was invited to come along atop an APC, which I'd never been aboard before. That APC was going through a place called Khojaly. So we went through Khojaly, we got to Imret Karvant, the guys did the picture taking and the interview making, and then we, at night, got back into our APC, went through a place called Kalbajar, then down to a place called Lachin, which is where the road connected mountainous Karabakh with Armenia and the city of Goris, and then back to Shusha. Then Boris Yeltsin decided that he was going to be making peace between the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis in Karabakh, and organized a mission that included the president of Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev, as well as a number of other Russian thinkers that he was bringing down from Moscow. Yeltsin was allegedly flying into this place called Khojaly, which had the only airfield inside of mountainous Karabakh. So we went to Khojaly and basically staked out the airfield for a number of days, only to discover that Yeltsin was flying in by a helicopter from another Azerbaijani airfield to the Karabakh capital of Khankenty or Stepanakert, where he had his mission of peace, etc., that obviously did not succeed. Meanwhile, I was in this place called Khojaly and was starting to dig deeper into the conflict about mountainous Karabakh and getting to know some of the individuals in the area, including the Khojaly airport commander, a gentleman by the name of Colonel Elif Khajayev. I can't say we became best friends, but we got to know each other, and I attended his funeral in early 1992 after he was killed, after the Khojaly Massacre of February 25, 26, 1992. In any case, willy-nilly, that is how I started becoming a war correspondent. It was not planned. Once again, it was kismet, fate, etc. That I had the tools to be able to do this thing that nobody else seemed to be doing. And so that is how I entered into the exciting world of international war correspondence, Karabakh being my first. Meanwhile, I'd been in Azerbaijan not a week or 2 weeks to look after now post-Soviet Azerbaijan, because the Azerbaijanis had declared their own independence. But I had taken up residence in Azerbaijan. I was attending the parliamentary sessions. I was getting to know all the players in Baku. And then one fine day, the Sunday Times, or I beg your pardon, the BBC called me up and asked what I knew about this guy with an impronounceable name, the president of Georgia, post-Soviet Georgia, who had just been pushed from power and was said by TASS and other Russian news agencies to have absconded with the national treasure in Tbilisi in the back of a car, gold bars or something, and had fled to Azerbaijan. What did I know about all of this? I made certain telephone calls among my Azerbaijani government friends and managed to establish that this guy, whose name, of course, was Ziad Kamsakordia, which I was unable to pronounce at the time, had indeed come to Azerbaijan and to the second city of Ganje, after which he had fled from Azerbaijan into Armenia, after Armenia had fled to Chechnya in the Russian Federation, and the capital there of Grozny into the protective arms of the self-styled president of the Chechen Republic, Ichkeria, a gentleman by the name of Dudayev. So it was hellishly complex, but I told the BBC as much as I could tell them. Somebody in London listened to the BBC and decided that I was the world's most recent expert on all things Georgian. I'd never been to Georgia. I couldn't pronounce the name of the president of Georgia. But there was a rumor that Zviad Kamsakordia had declared civil war from a balcony of a place in Western Georgia called Zugdidi. So the Sunday Times editor, who had heard me pontificating on the BBC, decided it was time for me to get to Zugdidi and get that all exclusive interview with Mr. Unpronounceable, and all in 3 days. Well, once again, using my connections in Azerbaijan and the fact that I was foreign journalist 00001, I managed to secure a plane ticket to Sochi in the Russian Federation, even though I had no Russian visa, I had no business being in the Russian Federation. I was just taking advantage of chaos. So I flew to Sochi, and after that, grabbed a car or a taxi and went to a place called Sukhumi, which was the capital of the Autonomous Republic of Abkhazia, part of the Georgian, the Republic of Georgia, but was also threatening to secede from the Georgian Republic. And from Sukhumi, I got to Zugdidi, and surprise, surprise, Zviad Kamsakordia had not declared the start of civil war from the balcony of the government house in Zugdidi, because he had not even been there at all. This was just Russian disinformation, which was being scooped up by other correspondents in Moscow and elsewhere. It was my introduction but I used it as my introduction to Georgia. I hung around Zugdidi for a while, then I went back to Sukhumi, started running into the supporters of Gamsagurdia in Sukhumi, devoted supporters, and started to change my mind about many things that I'd been told about Georgia and about Gamsagurdia himself, that he was a madman, that he was a fascist, that he was trying to ethnically cleanse all of Georgia from everybody but the Georgians. All of this was complete nonsense. Then in one of the worst winters of snowstorms, in that winter of 1992, I hitchhiked back from Sukhumi via Zugdidi, which is where the new government, the putschists, had come to oust the old government, those who supported Gamsagurdia. I managed to cross the lines, got to Tbilisi, and then finally from Tbilisi back to Baku. It had been a very eye-opening month or month and a half, just in time for the Armenians to surround this little town in mountainous Karabakh called Khojaly and ethnically cleanse it, killing some 633 people. And then I had to run out there and did the reporting for the Washington Post.
So your first introduction really into war reporting was to enter into Khojaly and write about it.
You could say it like that, although I was in Khojaly and certainly there was fighting going on the last time that I was in Khojaly, on the periphery of Khojaly. But some people think that I entered Khojaly during or after the massacre, and that is not true. I was in Agdam and its environs and the front line there, reporting from information I received from the refugees streaming out. Anyway, just to kind of bring things to a full circle, I'm back in Baku, and Gamsagurdia has shown up in Johar Dudayev's Chechen Republic, Ichkeria of Grozny, and there's going to be the 50th anniversary of the day of Chechen genocide, so-called, when Stalin and Beria shipped all the Chechens in the Ingush and others off to then Soviet Central Asia by a train. Half of them died en route, and this basically was the defining aspect of the Chechen personality, which we can still see today. Once again, using my contacts in Baku, I rented an empty Tupolev plane with all the seats removed from it, because it was flying to Grozny to pick up a bunch of Chechen merchants to have them, to fly them down to the Gulf, to Abu Dhabi or the Emirates, to buy refrigerators, this, that, and the other thing, to bring back to this wild free market in the middle of Grozny. So I got on my plane. It cost me $50. Got to Grozny. There was a guy sitting by a cardboard box who represented Chechen customs, not Russian customs. Checked me into Grozny, and thus began my relationship with Chechnya. I beg your pardon. The Gamsagurdia had died in Grozny, and his funeral was going to be the next day. And so I finally had to get up and see what was happening with all the Georgians in Chechnya at the time, thus running into the 50th anniversary of the day of Chechen genocide that I just described, where all these wild-looking Chechens are doing a zikr, or a remembrance of God, coming down the main street, followed by Johar Dudayev's army. And we're talking about marching soldiers, snap precision, jiu-jitsu fighters, the commandos led by Shamil Basayev, later to become notorious in Chechnya. And finally, then by, I don't know what type of missiles they were, but the APCs, the T-54 tanks, and then finally the missile batteries being brought down the main street. The last thing was Dudayev decided to throw a fashion show that evening with all the dress togs for his Chechen Air Force, his Chechen commandos, his Chechen army, and his Chechen Navy. Chechnya is landlocked. Now, was he claiming an island in the Caspian Sea? I don't know. But it was just totally bizarre. But it was also very sad, because one of the things that was evident was that war was on its way to Chechnya as well. And indeed, within the year, Boris Yeltsin had sent in his people, and the so-called first Chechen war was on. Once again, using my connections in Azerbaijan, I went incognito, this time not flying into Grozny, but smuggling myself across the river that separates Russian Dagestan and Azerbaijan into Dagestan, and then finally into Chechnya, where by coincidence, sluchaynost, kismet, shiksal, I ended up living in this little town called Samashki. It was my bolt hole, because my guide to Chechnya was from there. He could have been from any place else, but it ended up being Samashki, and thus became this deeply intimate relationship that I've had with Samashki and a certain family, that of the commander, Hussein, ever since.
Well, we're nearing the end of the program, and I wanted to ask you about, just for our audience, to talk about your new book briefly that you're getting ready, you're working on to publish. You're finalizing the edits now, and what is the name of this new book that's coming out?
So one day they're going to be calling me the diarrheist. On the strong recommendation of the original publisher of Azerbaijan Diary, Patricia Kolb at M.E. Sharp, that firm has now been bought out by Routledge. She said, "You have a brand name." And she was the one who came up with Azerbaijan Diary.
Oh, really?
I had something else entirely.
Huh.
I forget what it was. She came up with it, and the new book, which is on Turkey, I was going to call it The Bridge, right? The only country that has, a footprint in Europe and a footprint in Asia, etc. It's a cliche, but it happens to be true. She said, "No, you will call your book on Turkey, Turkey Diary. It's your brand." Because after the Azerbaijan Diary, out came the Chechnya Diary. Once again, it was not my choice as a title, but the publisher imposed that. And then finally, Georgia Diary. Once again, it was not my title, but by this time it was too late. I was the diary guy. And they are kind of diaries, of a very special and deeply personal kind. So the one little modification that I made with the Turkey book, which you could say that I've been working on for 40 years, going back to 1982, when I first showed up in Istanbul. Once upon a time, I did a scan of Amazon to see what titles were out there that were related to Turkey. And the first 245 had to do with special recipes for Thanksgiving.
And nothing to do about Turkey.
And finally you get down there, and then finally you get into Ottoman Turkey, this, that, and the other thing. And I said, the easiest way around this is to use the Turkish word, namely Türkiye. And so thus I've given the name of this book, Türkiye Diary, and then in subtitle, The Bridge, etc.
And when is it? And when is it coming out?
It's actually already out on October 11th, my 66th birthday. I gave myself a birthday present by putting it online on Amazon Kindle. So if you want to go take a look on Amazon Kindle, feel free.
Well, we will certainly do that. And we thank you for the opportunity to be able to discuss your life and share your experiences about the Caucasus. I've been lucky that enough in my career I actually was with you once in Nakhchivan on a trip. So you called it at that time the land of the presidents for its reference to being an area that has produced many of Azerbaijan's presidents. So, and it's a very important region. But that's another topic for another time. Our guest today has been Thomas Goltz. Very much appreciate your time today, Thomas. We look forward to talking to you again, and we wish everyone who participated and watched the show today happy trails.
Keep moving, moving, moving. Oh, they're disapproving. Keep them doggies moving.